Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line, but before we begin, thank you very much for 125,000 subscribers. We're now 1/8 of the way to 1 million subscribers. I'm sure we'll reach that any day by now. Thank you all for watching, thank you all for subscribing, thank you all for supporting my channel. And let's get straight to the front line. Let's switch things around and start with the northern parts this time. We see here that the Russian forces managed to advance a very slight bit here to the north of Sinkivka by the forest areas, where they are now attacking the road in between Sinkivka and the forest area, trying to separate the Ukrainian forces within the forest area from Sinkivka itself, after which they'll likely move further southwards through the forest. And throughout this front, the Russian forces continue their attacks, especially south of Sinkivka in the direction of Petropavlivka, but also in the eastern parts by Kislivka, Kotlyarivka and Stelmahivka. Moving on to the Bakhmut front, we see here that the Ukrainian forces have managed to capture half the village of Klishchiivka, and fighting continues in this direction, as they've also managed to advance in the direction of Andreivka, where they've managed to advance here to the west of the village. So the front line is by Andreivka and the forest patches next to it. This means that the Ukrainian forces have cut off the connection between Klishchiivka and Andreivka. There's still the one from the back line through the southern parts and eastern parts of the villages. However, the main route straight between them has been cut off, and the Ukrainians now have control over half of Klishchiivka. Moving on to the Orlivka area here to the south of Bakhmut, there has been a slight advance by Russian forces, as they've managed to break this fortification of the Ukrainian forces here by the edge of the front line west of Orlivka. As we can see, there are some trenches here, and this is a fortified position by the Ukrainian forces. The Russians, through the video here, has managed to push out the Ukrainian forces and then capture the area and push the Ukrainian forces back beyond the forest patch. Then we move further south all the way down to the Uledar area, where here the Ukrainian forces have managed to slightly advance in the direction of Shenchevko, which is here to the southwest of Pavlivka. Here the Ukrainian forces are possibly starting some sort of offensive operations, trying to capture these villages here that I'm going to line out, as they are now mostly isolated from Russian positions, with the Seremenivka area here, a village north of the main defensive line of the Russian forces. The Ukrainian forces are now able to threaten this main supply line between Seremenivka and these villages, which means that the only other supply line is off-road between the areas here to the south of these four villages. Each of these have a significant distance between them, and as such they are fairly isolated. This means that the Ukrainian forces will have an easier time attacking these villages and capturing them in comparison to before the capture for Roshaine, and now the Ukrainian forces would be able to concentrate their forces in these areas, allowing them to launch offensive operations. Which allows us to move on to the Ramelsky Ledge area, where here the Ukrainian forces have managed to advance south of Rivnopil, north of Pryotne, as they are trying to even out the front line. They've managed to push the Russians further southwards, and with this combined with offensive operations Staromayorsky and south of Rivnopil, combined with to the west by Pryotne, they are able to attack the Russian positions from three directions. This whole area is high grounds compared to the Ramelsky Ledge area, which means that the Ukrainian forces are here focusing on capturing the high ground before they move further southwards, to avoid what they have been experiences here northwards, and that is the Russians firing upon the Ukrainian positions from the high ground. This is much easier now because there's no villages here defending the Russian positions. They have now passed through the main ledge as well as the river lines in this area, so now there's mostly just open fields, which would allow them to have an easier time pushing on the Russian forces in this area. Then we move on to the Robotyne area, where here there's quite a few developments. Starting out, there are two new pictures of the Ukrainian Leopard losses, which brings the total to now 33. If you want to see the 31 others, there are previous videos, and also a pinned message on my Telegram showcasing every single picture or video related to those 33 Leopard losses. So what we're seeing here is that the Ukrainian forces continue building up their forces. There's been lesser offensive operations over the past 24 hours. There's been some developments previously that has been reported on now, but over the past 24 hours specifically, there's been less offensive operations. And we see that the main reason for this is that the Ukrainian forces have now reached the main line of defense of the Russian forces. And from the latest news, the Ukrainians have sent deep reconnaissance groups across the main line of defense, and that they have reached Verbove, allowing them to do some pinpointing and radio communication as to the Russian positions, fortifications, strong points, weak points, as well as targeting guidance. So these reconnaissance groups are working behind the Russian front line, and then we are seeing the Ukrainian forces gather their forces here to the north of Robotyne and in the general area of Robotyne, allowing them to then make a push in the Russian direction. So this indicates that the Ukrainians will likely focus on breaking through in this direction, either just focusing through the Verbove direction or moving further southwest towards the Novoprokopivka area and then pushing southwards in this direction to avoid the concentration of Russian forces in other areas. The fighting over the previous days have produced these two videos showcasing some of the fighting throughout the front line. One was shared by Wargonzo, which showcases some artillery shells on Ukrainian armored vehicles. 3 miss in a row before the 4th one finally hits. And then we see this other video which showcases 2 Ukrainian armored vehicles moving in the direction of the Robotyne area within the village itself, and they get shot at by Russian artillery. And this is the same area as previously reported on. So the Ukrainians have been consistently throwing armored vehicles throughout the Robotyne village, and every time they try to pass through the central part down to the south, they get hit by direct fire and artillery fire on their positions. That's it for the front. In other news, Ukraine has launched about 20 drones across the northern parts of Ukraine reportedly, and all the way to Pskov. Here in the northern western parts of Russia, they have allegedly damaged 4 transport planes of the Russian army here in the airfields in this area. And as such, they have managed to fly 20 drones 600 kilometers across, either through Belarus or around it, going through to Pskov here in the northwestern parts of Russia. There's also the possibility of them flying those drones from Baltic states or the international waters to the north of the Baltic states. However, there's no indication as to where they came from, only that they managed to get to Pskov and managed to hit these 4 transport planes of the Russian forces. Whether the Ukrainians are capable or not of transporting these drones 600 kilometers across to hit the Russian airfield, it doesn't matter, as they managed to hit it, and there is no evidence as to whether or not they did receive help. But the Russian side is already accusing that the Ukrainian side would not be able to accomplish this without NATO help. The final part to talk about is the balance of power between the two sides. So I spent some time analyzing all of the units on each side according to militaryland.net and Deep State Map. Starting out with militaryland.net, I counted all of the Ukrainian units as they have that very detailed laid out on this map. And looking at all of the Ukrainian units all throughout the front line, and every unit that is not sent to the back because they are destroyed or not usable, like the 831st Aviation Brigade. As such, I have counted all the ones by the front line or the ones recently updated, like the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, showcasing a latest update on the 3rd of August, meaning that they are still functioning, although they are in the rear as reserve forces. So counting all of these units, I counted a total of 100 brigades, which would be 400,000 soldiers if at 100% capacity. Of course, this is just an estimate. Likely the Ukrainian forces nor the Russian forces would be at 100% capacity. However, there is no way to verify exactly what capacity they are at, so I'm just going to be analyzing this power balance through the assumption that everyone has equal strength. And as such, the most reasonable way to analyze it would be at both sides were at 100%. So based on this, Ukraine has 100 brigades or 400,000 troops at the front line all the way from Kherson and up to Kharkiv, with 3 brigades or 12,000 soldiers in reserve. In comparison, looking at deep state map, I've counted the Russian forces here because that is where they have accurately analyzed the Russian movement and positions. And from this, I have counted 500,000 Russian troops, of which there are 6 Stormset units, 8 Bars units, 4 Ahmed units, 6 DPR units, and 2 LPR units. That means that the prisoners, which are the Stormset units, are 1/20th of the Russian forces. The Bars units are 1/16th of the Russian forces. The Chechens are 1/25th of the Russian forces, and the DPR and LPR forces are 1/16th of the Russian forces. That means that the Russian forces are 78.5% of the Russian army and 21.5% are extra units. Analyzing the balance of forces further, I got to the conclusion that the Russian forces had 48,000 in the Kherson area compared to Ukraine's 20,000 in the area. On the Zaporizhzhia front, the Russians had 88,000 in comparison to 68,000 Ukrainian forces. At the Vremevsky Lech area, the Russians had 56,000 compared to Ukraine's 28,000. In the Donetsk front, the Russians had 76,000 compared to Ukraine's 56,000. In the Bakhmut front, the Russians had 68,000 compared to Ukraine's 108,000. In the Siversk front, the Russians had 20,000 compared to Ukraine's 24,000. And finally, in the whole Svatovo, Kremenna, Kupiansk area, the Russians had 144,000 compared to Ukraine's 100,000. So Russia has a numerical superiority on every front except for Bakhmut and Siversk. And simplified, the Russians have a 2.4 to 1 advantage in the Kherson front, 1.3 to 1 in the Zaporizhzhia front, 2 to 1 in the Vremevsky Lech area, 1.35 to 1 in the Donetsk area, 1.44 to 1 in the Svatovo, Kremenna, Kupiansk front, and then the Ukrainians have a 1.2 to 1 advantage in Siversk and 1.6 to 1 advantage in Bakhmut. So what should we use these numbers for? This clearly means that the Russian amount of forces in the Kherson area is at such a significant advantage that the Ukrainians would be hard-pressed to do any offensive operations in that direction. As we see, 2.4 to 1 is not one that you want to be attacking in. The Russians would be at such an overwhelming advantage that it would be a terrible plan. Meanwhile, we see that the Ukrainians are advancing despite a numerical disadvantage in the Zaporizhzhia front. This is most likely stemming from the fact that they have most of their forces concentrated by Robotyne, while the Russians had been lagging behind in the transportation of troops from other parts of the front to this area, as is seen by the fact that they sent some reinforcements from Kremenna to this part of the front line, so that is a very far distance. In comparison, the Ukrainian forces were having forces in reserve by Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro, which is further close by rather than Kremenna. And finally, that the Ukrainian forces, despite their offensive, despite all other, the fact remains that Ukraine has focused the most troops around Bakhmut than any other front. The closest next to it is the Svatovo, Kremenna, Kupiansk front, and then the Zaporizhzhia front. So although they have been talking about this Zaporizhzhia offensive for such a long time, they have a significant amount of troops competing against the Russian forces by the Kupiansk-Kremenna area due to the large concentration of Russian forces, and there's also a large concentration of Ukrainian forces by Bakhmut, which is why we are hearing rumors constantly that the West is complaining about Ukraine having such a large force by Bakhmut for an operation that so far has produced hardly any results, in comparison to the fact that they wanted to break through in the Zaporizhzhia front, and they so far have been unable to. If they relocated 40,000 troops from Bakhmut, making it a 1-to-1 area, and putting these in the Zaporizhzhia front, they would have a numerical superiority here instead of the Bakhmut front. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.